Hey class. So I just want to go over the elements of fiction link here. Since this week we're, discussing first person, second person, third person point of view stories, plot. All these stories are great. These are all fantastic, classic stories. Guests of the Nation, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, How to Become a Writer, The Enormous Radio. Good stuff. And you're going to have to read all these stories in order to answer the discussion for this week. But if you've never really read fiction, and when I say read, I really mean read, peruse, right? When you peruse over something, you read it carefully, right? So reading fiction carefully is important, and taking your time with these stories and seeing what they're about, how they're structured, characters. There's so much to look at in terms of fiction, because it's not just a story that it's not just about plot, right? And about what the story is. There's more to that. There are these elements that make up fiction. Okay, so much goes into these stories, and the more you know about what fiction is composed of, the elements of it, the more you'll extract from these stories. And yeah, basically it's about, right, I think I mentioned this last week when I was talking about the syllabus and about the course, that excuse me, we read fiction and we read poetry and we read basically to connect on a human level with somebody we've never met, and it's about experiencing emotions, right? It's all about emotion and about making you think, right? Reading fiction is connecting. On the most basic level, it's about connection and about saying, wow, somebody else feels this way, or I've never thought about that, right? Or I've never had that experience, but I can relate to it in another way, right? So fiction is important. It's important to feed and nurture the soul, the human soul, with stories. And these stories that are in the module for this week are amazing. So when you're reading fiction, when you sit down and when you break it down, it's not simple, but we can, break it down into a couple of elements, right? Like setting, characters, plot, point of view, theme. And on a basic level, when you're reading, sit down and ask yourself these questions and consider these elements first. Consider, okay, what's the setting, right? You sit down, you read. Let's say you're reading The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, and you read through it. You're starting to read, like, okay, so it's set on a street at the beginning, and he's walking, right? And he goes into a convenience store, and then now it flashes back to another time. So you're just on a basic level just telling yourself, okay, where is it set, right? Setting is a where and when of a story. It is the time and place during which the story takes place. Is it nighttime? Is it daytime? You have to ask yourself too, are these important elements? Is it important where it's taking place? Is it important that, like in The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, is it important that it switches from a certain place to another place, and you're not in the convenience store anymore? Suddenly you're on a reservation somewhere, right? Is that important? Why is it important? Always ask yourself these things. Why is it important? So where and when, that's what the setting is. And we know this is common sense, right? So the functions: creating a mood, it's to show a reader a different way of life, to make the action seem more real, to be the source of conflict or struggle, or to symbolize an idea. A lot of stories take place maybe in a jungle, or in a dark place, right? A dark room to symbolize something, maybe the darkness of humanity, or the darkness of a person's internal darkness or something, right? So what or why is setting important? How is it functioning in the story? We have to ask ourselves these things. Next, how to analyze setting. What aspects make up the setting? Geography, weather, time of day, etc. Study the time period, which is also part of the setting. In the short story, Guests of the Nation, even though, the focus of that is like, or I told you guys to focus on plot in that story. Setting is very, very important in that story. Very important. I won't give it away for those of you who are still reading, but it is important that it takes place during this time in a certain place, because it kind of makes up, obviously, the conflict, right? When was the story written? Does it take place in the present, the past, or the future? How does the time period affect the language, atmosphere, or social circumstances of the novel, right? You could have something that takes place in the medieval times in Europe somewhere. So how does that affect the story overall? These are important things to consider. So characters. When we get to characters, we know about protagonists, right? A protagonist is the main character of the story. The antagonist is the opposition, right? The opposition, this person may not be bad or evil, but he or she opposes the protagonist in a significant way. Major characters are characters who play major roles in the story, including protagonists and antagonists. Minor characters are characters whose existence is there to support the story and have a minor role. So how to analyze characterization? Through dialogue, by the way they speak, physical appearance, their thoughts and their feelings, interaction, the way they act towards other characters. Are they static characters? Do they develop by the end of the story? What type of characters are they? What qualities stand out? Are they stereotypes? Are the characters believable? Right, so ask yourself these questions. I think next week we're going to be reading Hills Like White Elephants. And that short story is mainly just dialogue. It's a dialogue between two people in a train station in Barcelona. And it's just a conversation, but it's important, right? We'll talk more about that next week, but what do we get from the characters from their conversation? Are they saying things that are giving something away about them? Is their physical appearance important? Their interaction. These questions are important, right? Let me scroll down here. So when somebody asks you, what was the plot of a movie? You see a movie and you're like, it's great. And somebody asks you, what's the plot? Right? What do you tell them, right? Plot is the organized pattern or sequence of events that make up a story. So what happens in the story? It's the literary element that describes the structure of a story. It shows arrangement of events and actions within a story. So what happens in the story? That's the plot. The structure. It can seem kind of complicated, like plot structure, but usually, it's structured with exposition, meaning introduction, character, setting, and conflict. The problem are introduced, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. You guys have seen this. I'm pretty sure you remember from your high school days or middle school days. Is what we call Freytag's pyramid. Okay, Freytag's pyramid is this. And if I could draw out here, and we're going to see it right now in the next slide, but it's, exposition is like a line, and then it goes up, which is like rising action, and yet up at the top you have climax and then falling action, right? So a lot of stories follow this, and movies too, right? We have a little bit of introduction, we are introduced to characters, we're introduced to what's happening, and then we have the rising action, climax. Not all, though. Not every short story, novel, movie is structured this way. A lot of avant-garde film directors and writers who kind of think outside the box a bit, they're more postmodern. They don't follow necessarily this structure, but a lot of movies do usually follow this structure here. Rising action, climax, falling action. And so this happens a lot in short stories too. The short stories that you're reading, this semester, ask yourself, what is it structured this way? What is the structure? Why is it structured this way? What's the point? Mainly just ask yourself why. Be inquisitive. Ask, and keep asking. Why this? Why that? Why that character? Why did this character? I had a professor in college in my writing workshop. We would have to write short stories there, and we would workshop the short stories every week. I would turn in something, and then we'd workshop that, and then the next week somebody else would turn in their short story. My professor, his name is Russ Bradford. He's a great writer up at NMSU, and he would always start off, the first question every class period was, why does the writer start this way? Why did Victor start this way? Why is the short story start with this guy walking down a dark alley? Why? That was always his first question. Why this first sentence? Ask yourself that too. Why this first sentence? Why this last sentence? And it gets annoying. You're probably already annoyed with me saying and keep repeating why. It's important though. You have to ask yourself, why is this in the story? Does it matter? Right? So exposition, which is one right here. This line. Excuse me, let me go back up. This is exposition right here. Boom. This is introducing, right? Introducing characters. It occurs at the beginning of the story usually. Here the characters are introduced. We also learn about the setting of the story. Most importantly, we're introduced to the main conflict. So what is a conflict here, right? Is there a conflict? And we're introduced. And then we start getting into, what is this? This is rising action. This part of the story begins to develop the conflicts. A building of interest or suspense occurs and leads to the climax. Complications arise. And then we get to the climax, which is the peak. If you're on a roller coaster, this is where you're kind of overlooking everything, and everything's about to, go underneath you in that roller coaster. That's the climax. The turning point of the story, usually the main character comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way. This is the most intense moment. And what we call that an arc, okay? If a character has a change, usually they have to change, right? There has to be a change in the character for it to be, you could say satisfying to the reader, and not always. Again, a lot of this stuff doesn't, especially in a lot of postmodern fiction, this doesn't always happen, but usually there'll be a change in the character, right? Falling action. This is where we fall. Action that follows the climax and ultimately leads to the resolution. We have the resolution. The conclusion, all loose ends are tied up. We call that denouement as well. Either the character defeats the problem, learns to live with the problem, or the problem defeats the character. Special techniques. Sometimes we have suspense, foreshadowing, flashback, symbolism, personification, surprise ending. We'll see a lot of this. If you read someone like Flannery O'Connor, one of her greatest short stories is A Good Man Is Hard to Find. There's a lot of foreshadowing in that story. And, if you pay attention to those techniques, you figure, oh man, this is how it's going to end. And you figure out how it's going to end. It still doesn't stop it from being shocking at the end. That's a very shocking story. But, foreshadowing is great. Flashbacks in stories, symbolism, right? The use of specific objects or images to represent ideas is important. Personification. All this stuff really cool to use within short stories if you write your own short stories too. But things to look for when you're reading these writers, right? How to analyze plot. So ask yourself, what's the most important event? How is the plot structured? Is it linear, chronological? Does it move around? Like if you're watching a Quentin Tarantino film, which movie am I talking about? Pulp Fiction, right? Pulp Fiction jumps around a lot. And if you watch his first one, Reservoir Dogs, it jumps around as well. And so it works though. If you read a story like that, it doesn't have to be linear. You can start at the end, move to the beginning, go start in the middle. It just depends, right? So remember, ask yourself, why is it structured this way? What's the point? Is a plot believable? We have to suspend our disbelief though. That's why we read and we go to movies to kind of escape our own reality sometimes. So if it's believable though, that can touch you on a more emotional level sometimes, because if it's believable, it's like, wow, this can happen to me, or it's happened to somebody I know, right? Conflict. It's dramatic, the dramatic struggle between two forces in the story. Without conflict, there is no plot. Based on the source, conflict is divided into internal conflict and external conflict. The story I posted 2 stories last week, but the story of an hour. The story of an hour is a great example of this internal conflict and external, because she thinks her husband is dead, right? And internally she's so happy. She's like, I'm a free woman because he's dead, right? As horrible as that sounds, he's dead. I'm free. But she's telling herself, no, you have to calm down, and she's trying to calm these urges, these emotions, and make them subside a bit, but it doesn't work. She gets so full of emotion, raw emotion. It's this internal conflict of like, is this right for me to feel this way, that he's dead? And then, it's again the eternal struggle, right? In Ambush, the other story where he struggles to tell his daughter about killing someone, right, when he was in the war. So these conflicts, a lot of times they're in the characters' heads, right, or it's within their person, right? It's not just external. Maybe something else is going on outside, but internal conflict is always great because we've all been there, right? Conflict is categorized into character versus character, character versus society, character versus nature, character versus fate, or character versus self. How to analyze conflicts? How would you describe the main conflict? Is it an internal conflict? Yada, yada, yada. Point of view. I posted 3 stories with different points of view, written in different points of view, right? First person point of view, we know that's I, me, right? Third person is he, she, they, right? It's like the narrator can be either third person limited, which they know the thoughts and the feelings of only one character in the story, or they're omniscient, meaning it's godlike. It's like a big eye hovering over everything and it knows everybody's thoughts and feelings, right? So that's important to know. Who is the narrator? Who's narrating? Who's telling the story? Is it first person? Is it saying I? Is it like a recollection? Is it an unknown narrator? Second person point of view. I posted Lori Moore's famous short story, How to Become a Writer. That's second person point of view, because second person point of view addresses the audience directly, right? So that's a great one because it reads it's almost like a manual on how to do something, like a how-to, right? Great story, but it's important to ask yourself, who's telling the story? Why did they keep it in first person? Why not make it a third person short story? How to analyze point of view. Does the author speak through the main character? Who is the narrator? Is the story written in the first person? Is the story written as a detached third person? Or is it written in second person? Because there are a lot of stories, not many, but there are a lot that are written in second person. And theme is the central message. It's the main idea of the story. What is the story trying to tell you? What's it trying to tell you about life, about people, about the society, about the world, about us? That is what theme is, right? Maybe it's a lesson. Whenever somebody tells you a story, they're like, well, and the moral of the story was don't trust anybody, right? Or the moral of that story is be prepared because you never know what can happen. So the theme, there are so many themes, but what is the best stories will always try to teach you something, right? Or when you read it, after you're done reading it, you will think like, wow, that made me think about, my family, or how I should behave in certain situations, or whatever, right? So the best short stories always have a theme and something that to make us think, to think about. Now, how to analyze theme. How is the theme expressed? Are any elements repeated and therefore suggest a theme? Is there more than one theme? Could be. And lastly, mood. So what mood is the author trying to convey throughout the story? Are they trying to make you feel sad, angry, happy? Are they trying to make you laugh? And the author style, it just depends. Every author has a different style. So in all the readings that you will do this semester, you'll see authors with completely different styles from one another. And that's what makes it interesting, right? It's like a movie director. Everybody shoots movies differently, writes movies differently. So that's their own style. And they're how to analyze mood and, and style. But guys, this sheet, these handouts, it's like several pages. Just go over them on your own again. And when you're reading these stories, it would be a smart thing to do to go back here and then just read, how to analyze these certain elements of fiction, right? The setting, the characters, and what's happening. Because the stories I've picked for us to read this semester, and poems as well, they're not easy. Some of them, they're simple. They're what I call deceptively simple. So they seem, especially something like Hemingway, his short story Hills Like White Elephants. It's simple to read, very simple. It's a conversation between two people, but there's so much going on underneath that simplicity, which we'll cover next week.